Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
It was a complete feeling of I was overwhelmed by it, really, and totally captivated. And an overused phrase, I know, but I just felt I had met my soulmate. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
In this double episode, we're on the trail of Britain's most notorious conman. Mark Acklom, now 51, has pulled off numerous scams over more than 3 decades, starting his criminal life as a teenager, defrauding his own family. He's been on most wanted lists, faced prosecution, and been to prison several times, but he always returns with new aliases to defraud unsuspecting victims, leaving a trail of collapsed businesses and broken hearts in Britain and across Europe. We'll be talking to one of his victims, Carolyn Woods, about how Acklom manipulated her and hear how, years on, she's still trying to recover a fraction of the £850,000 of life savings he conned out of her. Martin, you've taken a real personal interest in the Mark Acklom story, haven't you?
It's been one of the stories that grips me more than many others, and I've covered it for a long time. I spent a lot of time, several years, tracking him across the UK, investigating his criminal network in Europe, and I suppose I can admit it did become personal. We've exchanged letters. I wrote to him, he wrote back to me. I once interviewed him in a prison in Spain when he'd just been jailed. I did become a bit obsessed because he is such a fascinating character. I've never chased a criminal quite like him. He's a very amoral guy, a perpetual liar. He can't seem to stop offending, and offending in a very horrible way. He fleeced his victims over many years. He found ways to avoid justice, but even when those periods where he was arrested and charged and given jail sentences, somehow he managed to get either bail or get freed early from those sentences. And because he was operating in Europe, where there are no strict border controls, he was able to flit from one country to another. One of his trademarks was to use a number of aliases. So he wasn't just Mark Acklom, he was also Zach Moss. He was Mark Conway. That's how he introduced himself to Carolyn in 2012. He always seemed to be somebody who was one step ahead of law enforcement. And what really struck me more than anything, I suppose, is his ability to con people was absolutely matched by his complete lack of remorse for what he did.
What I was fascinated with when I was researching today's story was that Mark Acklom's life of crime began so young, as a schoolboy at boarding school, and not just petty stuff.
No, he became infamous when he was 16 because he was at this rather posh boarding school in Eastbourne, and it emerged that he had stolen his father's gold Amex card and used it to, and this still seems extraordinary, to hire private jets. And he would fly his pals around European capitals, Paris, Switzerland and other countries, where he would treat them to very expensive lunches in top restaurants. It was an extraordinary thing. There are other stories about what he got up to, how he conned one of his teachers to give him £15,000 to play on the stock market because he showed a real aptitude for business studies while he was at school. When he was 18, he was put on trial for those crimes committed as a schoolboy, and it got massive coverage in the newspapers. He was big news as the schoolboy conman, but I started reporting on him again in 2012 when he stole the heart and then stole the money of a woman called Carolyn Woods. He eventually, very quickly, conned her out of all her money, something like £850,000, her savings and the money that she had got from the recent sale of her house. The extraordinary part of the story was, though, that when Carolyn went to the police, when she finally realised that she'd been conned, she told the police and they said, well, if you're the victim of fraud, then you must go away and fill in an online form, because at that stage, that's how British police forces were dealing with fraud complaints. But they were also very unsympathetic, and I'm sure Carolyn will tell us how she was made to feel like a stupid woman. And it was almost like detectives were laughing at her, saying, how on earth could you have been duped so readily? So the police seemed reluctant to help Carolyn. They dismissed, in a way, what she was trying to tell them, and to order her to go off and fill in an online form seemed ridiculous. So I started looking into what he'd been up to, and I went on the search for him across Europe.
And this was an elaborate fraud. Caroline will tell us much more, but he convinced her at one stage that he was part of MI6 to cover up his strange behaviour, I suppose.
There were so many extraordinary aspects to what he told her. To begin with, he said he was a wealthy banker working in Switzerland, and the first few times they met in the West Country, he convinced her that he was flying in each time on a private jet from Geneva or Zurich, wherever he was working in Switzerland. And she believed all that. And then, even more extraordinarily, he confided in her that he was actually also working for MI6. And he used that to explain his long absences. When we talk to Carolyn shortly, she'll tell us some of the extraordinary lengths he went to, the elaborate scenarios that he painted and turned up in various outfits to convince her that he was ill or he'd been shot or he'd just come out of hospital. But we'll let Carolyn tell us more about that.
Well, we will do that, and we'll hear more about your cross-border pursuit of Britain's most notorious fraudster and Acklom's early life soon. But now we're joined by Carolyn Woods to find out how Acklom conned his way into her life, deceived her, and the impact he's had. Carolyn, welcome to True Criminals.
Thank you.
Carolyn, how did you first meet Mark Acklom?
Well, it was a January evening. I was at work in a shop in Tetbury, and at about 5 o'clock, he just walked into the shop, and that was it. So it was the most ordinary event in many ways, although male customers were relatively few, but we did stock menswear in that shop. And he just walked in, but he did have a presence about him from the very moment that he walked through the door.
How did he strike you? What was that presence like when he walked in?
It was a sort of electric charm, if I can put it like that. I mean, he really made me sit up. And now that I know much more about that personality type, I would say that's probably a bit of a red flag, but very full of energy.
And it wasn't long after that you started a relationship?
Not at all. In fact, rather out of character, even in that half hour that he was in there. It was a very strange thing. Again, I realised this is probably a red flag, but I felt as though I'd known him all my life. I felt completely relaxed with him and at home, not at all on my guard, even though it was dark outside. I was in the shop on my own, and there was a man I'd never met before, being quite personal. And I did actually give him my phone number that evening and received actually almost too much attention from him that evening with text messages. And I was with friends in the evening, and then phone calls, which was actually a little bit off-putting, but sadly not enough to stop me meeting up with him the following day.
In a way, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think it was almost love at first sight and you'd had this romantic encounter and rushed headlong into it?
I did rush headlong into it. It's quite difficult now with so many years have passed, and of course I'm so much wiser. I definitely felt very attracted to him on that first evening, and even more so the following evening when I met him for a drink. And probably within a week, I did feel that I had fallen in love. So it was a very strong attraction. And yes, very quickly went into that feeling sort of head over heels, as though this must be the real thing. Anyone who's been in love probably knows that feeling, or has fallen very quickly in love. A lot of people seem to have forgotten about that when I subsequently talked about what had happened to me. But it was a complete feeling of I was overwhelmed by it, really, and totally captivated. An overused phrase, I know, but I just felt I had met my soulmate, which nothing could be further from the truth. But that's how I felt at the time.
I think we're beginning to understand how you were totally taken in by his charm and his lies. Acklom strung you along for almost a year. What story was he telling you about who he was and what he did?
Well, he told me that he was a multimillionaire, that he worked for a Swiss bank. This was the initial story. That then, he told me, was just a front, and that, in fact, he was working for MI6 and was doing all sorts of dangerous missions. He also told me that he came from a very wealthy family. He'd been to public school, but that he'd actually paid for a lot of his own schooling. Didn't seem to get on with his parents very well. That probably should have raised a flag with me as well. I never met any of his family apart from a very young daughter, who I didn't know was his daughter. I didn't meet any of his friends. But at the time, I think I was just enjoying this relatively exclusive relationship that I had with him.
Can you give us a sense, Carolyn, of how convincing he was, for example, about the story that he worked as an MI6 agent? Because he did go to great lengths to make you believe him.
He did indeed. In fact, he put on a lot of show for me, really. And the one regarding MI6, I've got no idea what a secret agent might look like. I imagine they come in all shapes and sizes, backgrounds and everything, but I know nothing very much about it at all. One day when I was out with him, he said to me that he had been called in. We were in London. He said that he'd been called in to MI6, that he was in trouble, mainly because of his relationship with me. So he was also doing this thing that he started weaving into the relationship, comments to make me feel guilty or that I was jeopardizing his career, this sort of thing. However, we did drive. He had a driver, an accomplice who was actually driving. He drove us to the MI6 building. There it was. We drove in front of it and then went around a few streets and came back. And I believed we were at a back entrance to that building. And he got out of the car, said he'd be about half an hour, and disappeared past two armed guards, or what appeared to be armed guards. There were two men in flak jackets holding guns, and went into what looked like an underground car park and reappeared about half an hour later. But I'm told there are no armed guards at MI6, although how anyone could be within a mile of it, even with replica guns, I have absolutely no idea. But I definitely saw that. I didn't imagine it. And then when he reappeared, he told me how he'd spoken to his boss. They'd played a recording of a phone call that I'd had with someone. He had a file this thick on me, which he said he wasn't going to read. He said that I'd done brilliantly, and that was the end of it. But yes, it was very convincing. I thought that he had gone into the MI6 building for a meeting.
Another time, he told you that he'd been on a mission in Syria and he'd been shot.
Yeah.
And you understandably wanted to see him. What happened?
Yes, well, I mean, he allegedly was undertaking a number of missions to Syria, and he did actually told me that he'd been shot, and he appeared with his arm in a sling, all bandaged up, and was sort of limping. He said he'd also been shot in the leg and the arm. Again, another very convincing charade. I'm sure he hadn't been shot. I'm sure he had no injury whatsoever. And these things continued because he also, at one stage, when I was probably asking too many questions, and he then told me that he had a brain tumour. He showed me images on his phone that he said were his brain, showing the tumour. And then when he phoned me one day, and I made a very innocent comment about that I was feeling a bit neglected, and he said, well, things were far worse for him. He was about to go into brain surgery, and how dare I behave? You know, I was out having lunch with people, and how dare I think that my situation was in any way anything to complain about. And I saw him at the hospital sometime later with his head all bandaged up and a drain apparently coming out of it. Again, that happened a couple of times. I went to the hospital. I didn't go into his room. He said he would find a way of coming out to see me. But it was very, very convincing. And on another occasion, he appeared, it sounds so melodramatic, but he appeared one night when I was in the house on my own. He let himself in and appeared in full combat gear, saying he'd left a troop of soldiers that he was training for action because he knew I'd been upset, but he was going to be in big trouble about this. But he had to come and see me. It was all my fault if he got into trouble. But there he was in combat gear. So he played lots of mind games and was very good at making me, well, he isolated me completely, but also made me feel very guilty about jeopardizing his situation.
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com.
You said that Acklom had isolated you. How was he able to do that?
Well, of course, when I met him, I was renting a small cottage outside Tetbury. I was very happy and I had a job. I found a job when I moved to Tetbury. So he told me that it was very important if we were to see each other at all in this 18-month window that he'd established, that I must give up my job because otherwise we wouldn't be able to see each other at all if I was going to work. So there was a big bit of my independence gone and also social contact gone. And then he told me he couldn't bear to see me in this tiny cottage. It was very difficult for him to come there because of security issues, this, that, and the other. And so that I must move into a house. And he told me, first of all, that he was buying a house that would be our marital home. Of course, he was already married. Then it was going to be a different house because there were security issues with the first house. So again, there was a lot of this sort of confusion going on. But he had convinced me to give him my notice at work and with my landlady. And then all of a sudden it was another house. It was a very big and beautiful house in Bath. But he sort of sprung that on me at the 11th hour, just took me there, said that there'd been a disaster with one house. The other one needed more renovations doing on it. And in the interim, we'd be living in this house in the centre of Bath. He took me around it. And really, at that stage, I had no choice because I had already given up or was handed in my notice at my cottage. I'd given up my job. And so I moved into that house. So I didn't know anybody in Bath. He'd moved me away from Tetbury. He'd got me to give up my job. And then he started telling me that I mustn't go to the door. He told me off one day when I came to the door to say goodbye to him. And he told me, I mustn't come to the door. You've got to stay inside. I don't want people knowing our business. You mustn't speak to people. It's very dangerous. All this kind of thing. And actually to the point where one day he said he needed to take my car, or his associate was going to come and take my car because it needed a service. And then he phoned me later in the day and said, what the hell have you been doing with the car? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, the brakes are totally useless. And then he said, look, I think someone's tampered with the car. So he started engendering all this fear into me so that I just retreated. I was rattling around this enormous house on my own, ended up sleeping with the light on and with the radio on, just in a very depressed, confused, isolated state. So I didn't really realise what he was doing at the time. And I did try to go out. I made myself walk out of the house and go into town every day, but very much with my head down. And I didn't want to look at anybody. I was not myself at all. And likewise, I didn't want to see my old friends who I had been seeing during the time between moving from Buckinghamshire to Tetbury and meeting Mark Acklom. people used to come and stay, and I saw all my old friends and I was trying to make new friends. But I got to the point where I didn't actually really want to see anybody because I was worried about questions they would ask. And he told me it was very dangerous and I mustn't tell anybody about my relationship with him and anything that he told me that he was doing. So, yes, I was completely isolated.
And all this time, Carolyn, was he living locally with a wife and family?
Oh, he actually was. Of course, I had no idea about that at the time. But no, I was living in a very fine mansion in Bath that I believed he owned. But in fact, it had been rented with my signatures forged on the rental agreement. And it was paid for in one lump sum out of money that I had loaned him for other things. And all the time, yes, he was living just a few miles away in another mansion, a big rectory, with his wife and 2 children.
Carolyn, you now know that what you describe as the mind games that Acklom was playing on you is what the police call a roping technique, feeding you more and more outrageous lies to set up a trap. It must be very difficult to look back on it now with the benefit of hindsight. But at the time, at that stage, did you have any doubts about the stories he was telling you?
I think I suffered from feeling very confused. So I suppose you could say that I had doubts, but I was so confused about what was going on. And I was, before very long, within a couple of months, I was in such a bad mental state myself that I wasn't seeing anybody. I just couldn't make out what was going on. And I think in one sense, the stories were so outrageous, but also these dramatic events that I believe were staged to convince me of it were so realistic. It doesn't cross your mind that someone could actually go to those lengths to convince you of something and that would all be a charade, or it didn't cross my mind. But one thing I remember when I started reading about people like Mark Acklom is they are very, very good at spotting people who are basically friendly, kind, empathetic, generous, those kind of people. And they manage to work on all those things. So he would always cut me dead. If ever I tried to question him, he was very good at deflection. He was very good at making me feel bad because he would just suddenly say this, that, or the other had happened, something terrible or was about to happen, or he was in jeopardy, and how selfish I was to be even thinking that I maybe deserved a bit of consideration, which actually during that period I did. And I had a breast cancer scare. And when I told him about it, it was just, well, you think you've got problems? I've got a brain tumor. So, yeah, very, very unpleasant tactics. But I think confusion rather than anything. I was totally confused.
But you were also in love.
Well, whether by that stage I was in love, I was head over heels in love initially. I think now I met Mark Acklom in January 2012. By January 2013, at least I had enough self-knowledge to realise that I had to get out of that house. I had to go somewhere else and try and get a little bit of my own life back. And I did leave. I told him. He was very, very angry. But I think if I hadn't actually managed to get out and I went to stay at a friend's flat, they weren't there. I was still very isolated. I was still in touch with him, but that sort of helped. And that's where he began to lose control. And I think actually at that stage, I thought, there's no way I can marry this man, because he had said that he was going to marry me again very cleverly, because it was a leap year, told me that I should propose to him, but he would just be enjoying all this. I think he just enjoyed really just unraveling me as a person and his other victims. I think he just loved that control he had over people. So I think I got to the point where I didn't think I wanted to marry him. But before I met him, I definitely said to friends, I never, ever want to get married again. And if I ever show any signs of it, have me locked away because I've obviously gone mad. Well, I think I had gone a bit mad with Mark Acklom. But I had said to him at the beginning of the relationship that I would wait for him for 18 months. He'd set up this time frame because he said he had this contract with MI6 and he had to know that I would wait for him. Unfortunately for me, I'm someone who sticks by my word. So even though I'd left that house in Bath, I was still in touch with him every day, but I never saw him in the next 6 months. And I waited the 18 months, well, just short of it. And then I found out who he was.
You were clearly a victim of an extraordinarily elaborate con. Can you just explain the money side and how he started asking you for money and what you ended up giving him?
Cleverly, actually, didn't ask for money in the beginning, but he had advised me to move all my money from the bank that I'd been with all my life into another bank. And he said it was paying a much better rate of interest. Now, the reason I had all this money was that I had relatively recently moved. I'd sold my house. I'd moved from Buckinghamshire, where I'd lived most of my life, and I was setting up a new life in Gloucestershire, and I was trying to buy my own house. Throughout my relationship with Mark Acklom, and right at the beginning, I said, whatever happened with us, I wanted my own house, my security. And he said anyway that the money that was in the bank would get a better rate of interest if I moved it to another bank, which was quite true. So I did that. And then we were going to the bank one day, and he seemed to take a phone call. Well, there was a phone call, but again, I suspect this was a staged call. And he was talking about paying contractors, having a bit of a cash flow problem, all this kind of thing. And this was all to do with the renovations of a house that he said he'd bought. And I knew the house, and I knew that it had recently been sold. He said he'd bought it, and it was going to be our marital home when he was in the country after we got married. And so I overheard this conversation, and I said to him, well, if you've got a cash flow problem, I've got all this money sitting in the bank. I can help you. And that's where it started.
Carolyn, once he had your money, and I think you were persuaded to transfer a lot of money over a very short period of time, once he'd got it, what did he do?
Well, once he'd got it, he didn't actually vanish out of my life. He was still around. But you have to remember also, he wasn't just conning me. I don't know what his bigger game was, but he was still around in the Bath and Bristol area. And you know, Martin, that he met a number of businessmen and other people. He was trying to worm his way into Bath society in particular. So he was still around. And actually, that was one thing. When I did start to say to people I was worried, and at the time I was worried because of this alleged brain tumour, and I thought he wasn't making decisions very well and he'd lost the ability to really think straight. People said to me, well, he wouldn't still be around if there wasn't something in the relationship because he had all your money quite some time ago. So it was a little bit strange. So for that whole year, he was around until the Christmas of 2012. And then I didn't actually see him, but he was in touch all the time. And again, well, I think I just, by that stage, probably was just hanging on to some hope. And so I continued to believe him to the extent that I went off to meet him in Nice when I really had virtually no money left whatsoever. And he didn't turn up. And I'm sure he just enjoyed that. He had me going out there in utter despair, hanging around in a hotel because I couldn't pay the bill that he was supposed to have paid. And I think he just really enjoyed seeing people in distress or hearing them in distress.
It's really hard to listen to what he did to you, Carolyn.
It was absolutely dreadful. I found out in June 2013 his real identity, which actually was extraordinary because once I had his name, I knew exactly who he was because I'd heard about him years before on the radio when he was a teenager. And we heard about this schoolboy who had stolen his father's credit card and hired a private jet and taken all his school friends off to Paris for a lobster and champagne gourmet weekend. I knew exactly who it was, and it was utterly astounding.
Carolyn, when the penny finally dropped and the full realisation sank in of how he'd conned you and how he'd fed you just a lot of lies, how did you feel?
I just felt completely devastated. I did feel very, very foolish. Also heartbroken, because actually the man that I'd fallen in love with, who I thought was an honourable man doing good things for his country, a brave person, risking his life, all that sort of stuff, Well, that person didn't exist at all. So I'd fallen in love with a fantasy, not a real man, because the real man was a horrible, evil, two-timing scoundrel, really, and also someone who'd been doing this all his life. So it was utterly devastating. And I felt totally abused. I felt abused emotionally, psychologically, sexually, in every way. I just felt totally abused.
Eventually, you did summon up the courage to go to the police. How did they respond to you when you explained what had happened?
When I found out who he was, I was staying with a friend in London. I went to the police. I went to Islington Police Station, and the officer at the desk seemed to find it quite amusing when I told him the extent of the fraud and I wanted to report this fraud. And he just gave me a leaflet and said, you have to go and do this online. So that was my first encounter with the police, and I didn't get the response that I was expecting at all. I was just sent away, and I asked my daughter and her boyfriend at the time to come and collect me, which they did. And I went back to their flat. And, well, I felt physically so sick. I could hardly stand up. It really was that bad. And that evening, I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't even close my eyes. Like, the room was spinning. I was just in utter despair. That's all I can say, really. It was utterly terrible. The whole of my life seemed to vanish before my eyes. It was, I couldn't see a future at all. And I did also feel terribly guilty as a mother, because although my daughters were grown up, they were in their 20s at that time, I just felt I'd really let them down, and my parents, because some of that money I'd inherited from my parents and was hard earned by my father. So all these sort of things were going through my mind, but I just didn't want to live at all. And I think if I hadn't had my daughters, I probably would have decided to get out of it. I couldn't do that to them, but I wanted to, for a long time. And even sometimes now, I do get those sort of feelings because I haven't been able to live the life that I want at all. And I've still got no independence, really, no security. And I'm not saying that there aren't days where lovely things happen. There are, luckily, there are lots of things I can enjoy that don't cost very much money. But no, it's been very difficult.
It's a horrendous story, and thank you so much, Carolyn, for reliving it for us today. We know it's not easy to do. We'll talk to you again in our second episode as we go into more depth on who Mark Acklom really is and what drives him. If you've been moved by Carolyn's plight and affected by our story today and want to try and help, then we've put a link to her book, Sleeping with a Psychopath, on our link tree. Hey listeners, The True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.